Yay! I'm so happy to be here today. You'll notice that in addition to the conference materials, there is a bit.ly link to session materials for today. This is the same Google Doc that's available in the conference materials that you already have had access to. We're putting it here for your convenience. My name is Nicole Tucker Smith, and I have been a teacher, a school principal, a district-wide coordinator of professional development and training. I'm also a parent, an author of the book Supercharge Your Professional Learning. So in case you like a little bit of this UDL taste that you're getting today, Supercharge Your Professional Learning is all about how to apply UDL to professional development and professional learning so that we can remove barriers for our adult learners as well. And let's talk about our goals for today. As mentioned in the title, we are talking about removing barriers to productive struggle. So we'll talk about the difference between productive struggle and unproductive struggle. And this is my hope for you today. Our goals are as follows: that you will be able to identify the steps of the UDL design process. Now, are you going to know all the things about UDL? Not necessarily, but I do want to help you understand the steps for designing with a UDL approach. And you'll identify those steps of the UDL design process in a way that reduces barriers to achieving rigorous learning goals. So that productive struggle is to help us achieve rigorous learning goals. You're also going to have an opportunity to observe, to see, and then hopefully then choose to integrate strategies for sustaining effort and persistence. And you'll have the opportunity to take away resources that inform the design of lessons that will facilitate learner agency. So those are the goals for our time together this afternoon. Here's a look at our agenda. We are going to start with the welcome and the goals, and I have an opening question for you. I'm going to open up with explaining what UDL is and the UDL design process. Then we're going to focus on one guideline in particular that is helpful in removing barriers to productive struggle, and that's the guideline called Sustaining Effort and Persistence. I will share with you several examples in mathematical practice, and we'll talk about how to design for learner agency and productive struggle. We'll close with a reflection and next steps. Along the way, our hope is that we'll have time for 2 breakout rooms that'll help you digest some of that information. And throughout our time together, please feel free to post questions in the chat. I will try to answer those as we go. And then after the breakout rooms, we'll also have time where you can unmute and ask a question as well, if that is a better way for you to be able to express the question on your mind. So that is the plan. And again, this is what the Google Doc looks like if you follow that bit.ly link that's in the chat. And on that Google Doc, you can also download the slides with notes, with note sections. You can download that in case it helps you to take notes as you go on the slides, or if you just want to, if it helps you have that handy. I also say that so you don't feel like you have to copy down everything that appears on my screen. You can download and save a copy for later. So now my opening question for you is this. Feel free to either just jot this down for yourself, maybe just think it to yourself, or if you want, you can even put it in the chat. But my question is this: as a learner, so not as a teacher necessarily, but as a learner, as somebody who is learning, what helps you feel safe to try something new or unfamiliar? Take a moment to think about that from your perspective as a learner. What helps you feel safe enough to try something new or unfamiliar? I love these responses in the chat. Yes, and so many of you, feeling safe to fail. Many of you have mentioned the people who are with you. Who's with you in that learning process matters. Relationship matters. Having private space to think about it matters. Being able to ask questions and not be judged. Being able to make mistakes and learn from them. Seeing examples. And then so many of you said time. Having time to process, time to think. Sometimes we think we can do more by cramming things in, but we often have to focus on what's most important and give enough time for that. Yes, and then again with our relationships, having somebody to back you up. Yes, yes. Thank you for sharing that, and keep that in mind. You'll also see that in our session today, talking about the right mindset. And we'll talk about how do we cultivate the right mindset. So thank you. This is a great group already. I can tell this is on fire, the chat here. All right. So now let's talk about UDL in general. So keep in mind what you would need as a learner in order to feel safe to try something new. And hold on to that. And we're going to think about how might the UDL design process help us design learning environments where our students can have some of those same elements, the trusting relationships, the permission to explore without judgment, to the permission or the ability to fail and learn from those mistakes. And so the UDL design process, here's the definition. UDL, this is a definition that Cass put out in 2018. UDL was founded in the 90s, but is continuing to evolve and grow as the research and the literature around the neuroscience also grows and evolves. And the current definition for UDL is that it is an approach to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all by setting clear and rigorous goals, anticipating barriers to those goals, and then proactively designing to minimize those barriers. So it's not about lowering expectations, but it's about saying, what are some barriers that may be in the way that don't have to be here? We can anticipate them, remove them by supports, scaffolds. Many of you mentioned scaffolds in the chat, are options that will help minimize those barriers. And in applying this definition, this approach to optimizing teaching and learning, these are the 4 steps for a UDL design process. Now, many people, when they think about UDL, they think about that chart, but that chart only works with this specific process in mind. So before you pick up the UDL framework, which looks a little bit like, I'll show you, looks a little bit like this. We're going to talk about it in a moment. Before you jump to this framework, what you actually want to do is start by thinking about what is the learning goal. So for any lesson or even any moment in a classroom learning experience, the first question we ask ourselves is, what is the goal? Our first step is to clarify the learning goal and success criteria. That is step number 1. And these steps are also written out for you in your handout as well. So step 1. We have to get clear on what is the learning goal. And some of that clarity comes from defining what are the success criteria. So you can look at your curriculum for that. You can look at the standards, but you want to be clear on what is it that we're actually trying to help learners achieve. Then the second step is to anticipate what barriers there might be that might make it more difficult for students to achieve that goal. So are there some barriers to achieving that specific learning goal? Now, I have to define what barriers mean, because sometimes what I say is barrier is not what other people think is barrier. Here's how we define barriers with a UDL approach. Barriers to learning are sources of unproductive struggle, often due to inflexibility that is not in service of the learning goal. Okay, so there are sources of unproductive struggle, and we'll talk about unproductive and productive struggle, what that means. But usually these barriers show up because learning environments and instructional activities can be inflexible. This is the way we've always done it. Well, this is how it shows up on the standardized test. And only having one way for students to access information and respond and show what they know is inflexible. And that inflexibility is often not in service of the learning goal. So sometimes folks might say, well, I have high standards and high expectations. It has to be turned in by this due date. That is actually not written in the standard anywhere. Your due date is not written in the standard anywhere. So we can talk about how do we have flexibility that is going to remove those barriers so that students can achieve rigorous goals. Okay, so barriers are sources of unproductive struggle. Well, what's unproductive struggle? Let's compare it with productive struggle. So productive struggle is effortful learning that develops creative problem solving. Productive struggle is a good thing, right? It helps us take time and space to make sense of information. We are much more likely to understand something and be able to apply it if we've taken time to construct some of that meaning on our own. And that comes with having the time and the space and the support needed for productive struggle. Productive struggle is in service of learning goals, higher order thinking. Unproductive struggle, as I mentioned before, are unnecessary barriers that prevent achieving a learning goal. And these unnecessary barriers often show up in, this is just the way we've always done it. If we are assessing student information and there's only one format that they can express their understanding, if that written format or whatever that one format is, if that's not the best way for a learner to express themselves, then they're going to leave thinking, well, I just can't do it, when really they just had an inflexible format. So we're going to talk about how we can bring some flexibility to our learning environments to support productive struggle and remove barriers that are a form of unproductive struggle. One more thing we have to understand about barriers before we can look at specific lesson ideas, though. With UDL, we have this core idea that barriers are in the environment, not the learner. When we're designing our lessons and our learning experiences and even our learning environments, we have to think about what are the barriers in the learning environment rather than fixating on declaring barriers as being within the learner. And when we shift to thinking about what are the barriers that are in the environment, we're giving ourselves agency and space to address those barriers, to say, these are barriers that I, as the designer of this learning environment, can remove, can adjust. But if I only fixate on perceived barriers within the learner, I'm actually giving up my agency as an educator. So here's what I mean by shifting from thinking about barriers in the learner to looking at what barriers may exist in the environment. It requires shifting some familiar phrases. These phrases are examples of seeing barriers in students or fixating in barriers that we perceive to be in students, rather than shifting to examine what may be present in the environment. The first one is the one I hear the most. Students aren't motivated. And that may be true. But what are we going to do about that? Instead, we need to look at the barriers to motivation. Another one we'll hear is students are behind. Okay, but what do we do about that? Another one, the third one I want to share with you, students give up too easily. If we only stay in this lane on the left side here, we make it much more difficult to actually address barriers that may be causing those reactions that are present in the environment. So instead of thinking about students aren't motivated, let's ask ourselves, what may be some barriers to motivation? Because that we can actually do something about that. And are we going to get it right the first time? Maybe, maybe not. But only fixating on students not being motivated is not going to move the needle. Instead of thinking about fixating on these students are behind, that's the number one thing I heard coming out of, the COVID pandemic, especially. Students are so far behind. Okay, and maybe we should consider tiered options and supports. Maybe we can think about how we might activate or supply background knowledge. But that shift actually gives us more agency as the designer of the learning environment. And then we're really going to talk about this one a lot today. We're going to shift this idea of students give up too easily. Instead of fixating on that, we're going to ask ourselves, what may be some barriers that students face when engaging in a task that requires productive struggle? So take a moment to think about that, and you may even link it to how you've felt as a learner. And then you may want to think about picturing your students. Take a moment to think about this question. We're going to make this shift from students give up too easily to thinking about barriers in the environment. What may be some barriers that students face when engaging in a task that requires productive struggle? Yep, thank you for those of you who are adding in the chat. Yes, yes. Yeah, and so many of you have some things that I've noted as well, right? Some barriers to that students may face is sometimes when you're engaging in productive struggle, the goal may be clear to the teacher, but the students are not understanding what the purpose is, right? They're engaging in the struggle, but they're like, I don't understand the goal, so it doesn't feel worth it to keep struggling. They don't understand how it connects to what they did yesterday or what they're going to do tomorrow. So they're unclear on that goal or the purpose. And then several of you also mentioned this, anxiety or fear of making a mistake or not getting it. I'm not going to get it right. And we'll talk about some of those other things that you mentioned in the chat as well when we talk about learner variability. So those are a couple of barriers. And we're going to talk about how do we address some of those barriers. I'm going to give you some concrete strategies. But one of the reasons why we want to make this shift from fixating on thinking about barriers in students to thinking about barriers in the environment is this, and Jeff has heard me say this so many times, but I have to say it again. If we fixate on saying these students can't, these students won't, these students don't, we're setting ourselves up to be disappointed because we can't change people, but we can create a space that invites change to take place. And that is part of what we are doing with the UDL design process. Now, are we doing things for the students? No, we're creating a space that invites change to take place. So the first step is getting clear on our goals and success criteria. We're going to anticipate some barriers to achieving those goals. And then the third step is to embrace variability in relation to the goal. So with whatever our learning goal is, how might learners vary in relation to that goal? Now let's talk about this word, learner variability. Learner variability. So learner variability is the dynamic and ever-changing mix of strengths and challenges that makes up each learner. Everybody here has strengths, everybody here has challenges, and those strengths and challenges are going to show up differently depending on what context you're in, right? You may have a lot of confidence in a particular subject area and less confidence in another subject area or another field altogether. And so learner variability doesn't think about learners as fixed, as I'm good at this all the time, right? But we know that it can change and ebb and flow with context. And that's a quote from UDL Theory in Practice. So if we are going to embrace learner variability, what that means is we have to think about, with respect to productive struggle, because we're thinking about that context of productive struggle in math, take a moment now to think about how do learners vary when it comes to engaging in tasks that require productive struggle. And I'm going to go ahead and share with you, because many of you said this in the chat already when we were talking about barriers. Students are going to vary in terms of their level of confidence, right? That's just facts. And some of that confidence has been developed over time, right? Maybe they've experienced a lot of failure in the past in a way that was non-supportive and judgmental. So that's going to lower their confidence level. Or maybe they've been in inflexible learning environments where you could only express your understanding in a certain way, and it reduced how they felt about themselves as a learner. Learners are going to differ in terms of their past experiences. Maybe some students have had teachers who've been very supportive and encouraging and created those relationships where they felt safe enough to take risks. And maybe others have been in a more punitive learning environment. And then the third one is so important when it comes to productive struggle. Students may vary in terms of their sense of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is my belief that if I put in the work and effort, it will make a difference and help me achieve learning goals. If I don't think that my effort is actually even going to make a difference, then I'm less likely to even try. Because why bother if putting in the effort's not actually going to result in a different outcome or a positive outcome for me? So those are some ways in which learners may vary with respect to productive struggle. There's lots of ways in which they may vary, but here are a few with respect to productive struggle. Because it's after we have taken a look at clear goals, anticipating barriers to the goals, how learners may vary. After we've taken account that information, then we go to the UDL guidelines. And we think about how might we design options to reduce those barriers and honor the learner's variability. Just because learners are different doesn't mean they're necessarily operating at a deficit. A difference does not equal a deficit. It's just different. And left to our own devices, we'll design the best lessons for ourselves, or the best lessons that we feel comfortable with. Without embracing learner variability, we're not thinking about what may be barriers for others. And so we use these first three steps to then pick up the UDL guidelines. And there is a link in the chat to those UDL guidelines. We're not going to have time to look at all the guidelines. We're just going to focus on this one called Sustaining Effort and Persistence. But here, the UDL guidelines, UDL has 3 principles. This principle that is often expressed in green is about providing multiple means of engagement. It's recognizing that learners are going to vary in terms of how they will prefer to engage in information. And you know what? I taught middle school. Their preferred methods of engagement change from day to day, not even from student to student, but from day to day. Actually, it was different in the morning than the afternoon, right? So we know that it's going to vary. The same thing's not going to work all the time. So therefore, we need to anticipate in advance, how can we have different options for engagement? The second principle here is about providing multiple means of representation. That is how we represent the information, and then students are able to take that information in and turn it into meaning. We need to present information in multiple ways so students are able to make sense out of it. And then the third principle here, often represented in blue, is providing multiple means of action and expression. That's multiple ways for students to show what they know and progress towards goals, navigate the learning environment. There can be different products that they produce, but there can also be different pathways to a culminating product. So I'm going to pause here before we dive deeper, because what we're going to do next is we're going to dive into sustaining effort and persistence. And I want to check the chat to see if we have any questions so far. Yes. Okay, great. I'm looking at some of the comments here. All right. Yes. Oh, thank you, Jeff. Yes, that is the website for the UDL guidelines. And if you go there, you can get to an interactive version of it, and you can even dive deep. This is the one we're going to talk about today, providing options for sustaining effort and persistence. I highly recommend that you bookmark that. Take a look at it if you're unfamiliar with it. It also has all of the research that informs all of the guidelines and checkpoints. So I mentioned the 3 principles. Each principle has 3 guidelines for a total of 9 guidelines. And the guidelines here all start with the term provide options for, because one size does not fit all, right? Provide options for. We're going to focus on this guideline, provide options for sustaining effort and persistence. What does that mean? Now, some of this terminology can be a little dense, but what does it mean to provide options for sustaining effort and persistence? I like to think about it like this. When the going gets tough, what do? Do we give up or do we persevere? And I like to think about this guideline as like whitewater rafting. Many of you mentioned with productive struggle, one of the first things you think about is, well, who am I productively struggling with, right? Who else is in the room with me? You're thinking about relationships. And so think about this whitewater raft here. So there's an image of a whitewater raft, and inside there are several people rowing, and there's one person standing in the back. He's, you know, kind of guiding. He's the guide down this river. And they probably feel a little safer that they have a guide who knows a little bit more and has some expertise, but he's not doing all the rowing. He's helping them do the rowing, right? And there may even be somebody on this boat who's like, I don't know about this, but guess what? They're in the boat, so they're going to keep moving. And so a lot of times with sustaining effort and persistence, we have to think about how can we work collaboratively or interdependently, right? So that when the going gets tough, if we work individually, we'll be more likely to give up. And so in your materials, there is a link to a Padlet. And this is another thing that I say, bookmark it or make a copy of it, because I'm going to highlight a few strategies, but there's a lot of strategies on there. Today, I'm going to highlight some math-specific strategies, but these are on that Padlet are math plus others. And so you may want to take a look at that later, but they're all concrete strategies, tools, and resources to support sustaining effort and persistence. But so there's the Padlet link. It's in the materials, but then also, just to give you kind of the highlight, when we're thinking about sustaining effort and persistence, some of the things that we can do just in terms of our environment is making sure that the goal feels relevant, thinking about ways to vary demands, optimize challenge. Oftentimes when I'm working with teachers and they say like, oh, these students aren't motivated, these students don't want to do anything, I'll challenge teachers and I'll say, think about what options might you give to a student who needs more challenge. And let's say, I can't even think about that. They won't do any of this stuff. And I say, okay, but just think about it. What options might you give to a student who needs more challenge? Design those options in. See what happens. Just see what happens. And it makes a difference, because when we start thinking about, well, what would we do for a student who needs more challenge? We start thinking about choice. We start thinking about creativity. We start thinking in a way that is actually more inviting than focusing on students can't. And with sustaining effort and persistence, we're thinking about collaboration opportunities and structured peer-to-peer interactions. So I'm going to share with you a few structured peer-to-peer interactions. We're also going to talk about mindset. How do we encourage a growth mindset? And how do we offer mastery-oriented feedback? So the first strategy I want to share with you, and this is a strategy that I often see done most frequently in math classrooms. You can do it in other classrooms, but this works really well in math classrooms, is the idea of numbered heads together. So when we're engaging in opportunities of productive struggle, numbered heads together, and often it's not exclusively owned by Kagan, but Kagan includes it as one of their collaborative learning strategies. But numbered heads together works like this. So let's say students are working in a group of 4. Each student is assigned a number. The teacher may give a question or a problem. But notice, before they work together, the teacher gives independent think time. Remember, many of you said with productive struggle, you need some time. That is very important. Before you have students just dive into groups, to give that independent think time first, at least 2 minutes, to have them think about the question or the problem. Then students move into groups to discuss the question, work together, and ensure everyone has a common understanding and can produce a common answer. So that small group, everyone is coming up with the same answer. They're coming to consensus. This is what our group thinks is the answer or response to this question or problem. Then the teacher calls everybody back together as a whole group and then calls on one number. So remember, each student had a number, and I might say, okay, number 3s, everybody who is a 3, come share your group's response. And like, if you're doing this on Zoom, you could be in a private chat. If you're doing it in person, then you could share that response out loud or on the board, or it could be projected, but they're not just showing what they think, they're sharing what the group thinks. So that's one way to structure peer-to-peer interactions. And don't worry, I'm going to give you some time in breakout rooms to process these. I'm going to share with you 3 things and then give you time to process. So there's numbered heads together. Now, what's also helpful with supporting, many of you talked about scaffolding. When we think about peer-to-peer interactions, another resource is math sentence frames and sentence starters. So if we're promoting math discourse with students, we can use sentence frames and sentence starters to help our students practice using academic language, develop more practice and skill in communication and critiquing. Using sentence frames and sentence starters helps to build an understanding of math vocabulary in specific contexts. And it helps our learners engage in discourse connected to mathematical thinking. And so one of the resources in your handout, and actually, let me just show you this so everybody knows what I'm talking about. If I go to this handout here, right on page 2 is a list of lots of resources. So the one I'm talking about now is called Supporting Mathematics Discourse with Sentence Frames and Sentence Starters. And if you take a look at that resource, it gives kind of the purpose of it, but then it gives specific examples of the types of sentence starters that are often beneficial in a mathematics lesson, right? So there's generic ones, but then you can also focus on a specific mathematical skill. And having that framing can help students have the scaffolding they need. And here's the thing about scaffolds, is eventually scaffolds fall away. So you can have those sentence frames as an option, and students may use them when they need them. But once they start to not need them, it'll become part of the way in which they're used to having conversations. Now, but here's also the beauty of a scaffold. If I find myself in a more challenging situation, I can remember that previous scaffold and go back and use that strategy. Sometimes we're afraid to apply options like this because we think we're making it too easy. But actually what we're doing is we're helping learners learn how to navigate to what they need. And then when they get to more challenging places, they can go back and say, oh, I do remember that strategy or that tool. This resource also has information on using sentence frames and starters to deepen student thinking, and then sentence frames and starters to support peer critique, like if they're critiquing the work and supporting one another or trying to understand what they're, I wonder how you did this. I like how you did this, right? So it's giving feedback, some of that peer feedback support. And then there are also some sentence frames for educators to support us as we are critiquing students and helping them grow. All right, I'm going to share with you one more strategy before we do breakout rooms. And then I'm also going to open the floor for questions. Okay, so the third strategy I want to share with you before I give you a chance to discuss in breakout rooms, and some of you may be familiar with this, but it's a math conference. I think I need to share it just in case you're not. My favorite no. So I'm going to play this video, and as you're watching the video, think about how does this teacher support students in sustaining effort and persistence? And then know that after we watch this video and come back together, you'll have time where you can meet in small groups and kind of talk about how does any of this apply to your context. Now, just in case you're, I optimized it for sound and all of that stuff, but just in case your Wi-Fi can't handle seeing the video clearly, I also put the link in the chat so that, or not the link in the chat. I also put the link in the resources, so you could just go to the video directly if that is your preference, if you don't want to watch it this way. But one of the reasons we're watching a video is so that we have a common point of conversation about supports for productive struggle. Okay. All right, so I'm going to play. Somebody give me a heads up if it's not working.
Hi, my name is Leah Alcala. I teach 8th grade math, and this is my warm-up routine that I do with my students almost every day. I call it my favorite no. Okay. Good morning, you guys. Your warm-up is on the board. I'm going to hand out your index cards. I put a warm-up problem on the board, hand out index cards to all the kids, have them write their answer. I collect it, and then I sort it. And I say yes, no, yes, no. And I look for my favorite wrong answer or my favorite no, and we analyze that. 4 minutes to work on it. Everyone makes mistakes. We're gonna see your mistakes, you're gonna see my mistakes. But a mistake is your opportunity to share with me how much you understand. And if I don't know that you don't know something, I need to teach you before the test. The test is too late. And this is a great spot for me to teach you. Make sure your name is on your card. Put your pencil in your pencil slot and pass your cards to the center. I started my warm-up routine to replace clickers that a lot of classes are buying. So that was a clicker for each student. You ask a question, they lock in an answer. And then you look at your computer screen and you know what percentage of your students understand the problem. Well, we didn't have the money for that, so instead, okay, here we go. I thought, well, what if I gave everyone index cards, collected them real quick with their answers already written on it, and then I can just sort them as quick as possible and find out what percentage of my kids know the answer. No, yes. Costs 40 cents instead of $15,000. Yes, so we have quite a few yeses and some very interesting no's. 1, 2, 3, 4. I then took that a step further, something I couldn't do with clickers. 7. Look at the ones who are getting it wrong. How far are they from getting it right? And showing that work to the other kids. Okay, my favorite no. Someone wrote this. I say it's my favorite no because I want the kids to first of all recognize what they're about to see is wrong. And I want them to recognize that there's something good in the problem. Like there's a mistake, but it's my favorite no because it showed some good math. So that's the wrong answer. But they did some things that I love. What in that problem am I happy to see? We always talk about what's right first, so that if it's any student's work, they are like, oh, I did do that right. There's a mistake, but the mistake didn't ruin the whole thing. What do I like about this problem? Gavin?
Well, they distributed both with the 4x and the -2.
Very nice. And what? Today's lesson was on factoring, so I needed to make sure they understood how to distribute. They distributed, and what lets you know that they distributed? David?
How there are no more parentheses.
There are no more parentheses, and they didn't just drop the parentheses. So they're asked to distribute a term with a variable. They're asked to distribute twice. They're asked to distribute a term with a negative sign, which is often a very common mistake that kids make. And my students do not. Like, I have 3 years of CST data now to show that one mistake my students do not make is distributing a negative, which is amazing because they used to all the time. Distributing -2 to -6 is +12. And that was one mistake I was absolutely looking for and I did not see, which made me very happy. Not until the very end, as we've gone over different sections of the problem that are right, that I will then ask, okay, now what is incorrect? What does this person not understand? Where's the mistake? If I get a third of my class raising their hand ready to tell me the mistake, it's pretty high engagement at that point. Mia?
Like 4x times 2x equals 8x squared.
Very nice. This 4x times 2x multiplies to 8x squared. Can someone convince me of that? How do we know that 4x times 2x is 8x squared? My low-level students are very engaged. They feel like they're not getting penalized for being wrong. They're not being made fun of. I'm not looking at them. No, there's no peer pressure at this point. But they're like, wow, that's my mistake. And now I understand. It's very comforting. I mean, I feel very with my kids at all times. I'm not surprised by what they don't know. They're not surprised by what they don't know. It's how it should be. It creates more of a dialogue with me and them.
All right. So many of you may want to share that video with colleagues, so hold on to that link. This is and I'm going to let you talk about it in the breakout rooms. But one of the reasons why I really like this example is because it's a great example of having tiered options within the same activity, right? So even if you may have made a mistake or struggle, you can see where that mistake can be adjusted. And even for students who have the right answer, they're paying attention the whole time, because you don't know until the very end what the right answer really is. So you really don't know if you got it right until you get to the end. And the teacher is challenging students to say, can you convince me of that? Can you elaborate on that? So what I would love for you to do in the breakout room, I've shared with you 3 strategies. Can you think of how you might be able to apply these strategies in your context? And I love the things you've already been saying in the chat about how you can use it with your elementary students and how you can use it with your 6th graders. So take a moment to chat. We're going to open up the rooms. How might you use numbered heads together, math sentence frames, or something like my favorite no, to reduce barriers and embrace learner variability in your context? Awesome, awesome. So a few people are already sharing in the chat some thoughts that may have come up in your breakout room. Please feel free to add any other ideas that you want to contribute to the whole group about how you might be able to apply these strategies. I love this idea about helping students, spending more time to help students be able to talk about math, right? That discourse opportunity. Does anyone want to unmute with either an observation, an idea to share, or a question? Does anyone have a question?
Hello.
Yes.
Hi. Okay. So maybe if I could sum this up, 3 things that I guess stuck out for us as a group we discussed were these activities. So for example, if it was the numbers activity, the numbered group would encourage math conversation. My favorite number would encourage risk taking, without feeling like, oh, there's a shame or somebody's going to know what I'm going to say or what my answer is, right or wrong. And then thirdly, the number group activity again, making all students responsible for information because they don't know who will be called on. So they have to participate, they have to be invested so that they are prepared.
Awesome. I love how you hit those highlights there, right? So they're working together, they're knowing they're prepared, that they're, it's encouraging that they're not being penalized for making a mistake. Awesome for sharing for your group. I love that. And I'm also noticing here in the chat, people are mentioning there's something here I see about using some of the skills from Writing Revolution to help guide sentence frames. I love interdisciplinary work, right? To help think about how those options can support one another. Oh, and somebody shared in the chat an error analysis activity. I love this. Yeah, so really my favorite no is an error analysis activity. And so someone just shared an algebra by example in the chat. I'm going to save that. How do I save that? I'll copy. Okay. All right. I have to come back to that one. I want to take a look at that one myself. Awesome. So I wanted to share those 3 concrete examples of some ways in which we could support productive struggle. And now I want to shift the conversation just a little bit, And let's talk about learner agency. So there's productive struggle, right? There's creating a safe space for productive struggle, but then we also want to cultivate this idea of learner agency, and they go together, they work together. Learner agency is when learners are able to be active. So they're active learners who are able to make choices in order to fully participate and make progress towards goals. So with agency, there's not a coercion thing. It's I see that goal, I want to pursue it, and I can take the steps I need to as a learner to get there. So learner agency is about being active learners, able to make choices so that we can fully participate and make progress towards goals. Now, cultivating a space for learner agency means that we also need to support learners in developing a mindset of self-efficacy. What I mentioned before, that, oh, if I put in the effort and the time and the work, it can make a difference. Now, how we support learners in developing this sense of self-efficacy is highly influenced by the type of feedback that we give them. And so I'm going to share with you another quick video. And many of you are probably familiar with the work of Carol Dweck. This is just a quick synopsis of one of the studies about how we offer praise and how different types of praise can promote a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset where I do have a sense of self-efficacy. So we're going to watch this quick video thinking about how does it help promote learner agency, to think about how we shift our feedback. And then I'm going to share with you 2 tools to help us think about how we can think about our feedback and how we can also help students think about their ability to give feedback themselves. Reflection, that's what self-reflection is. Okay, so first let's take a look at this video. It's about praise and mindsets. Praise and mindsets. And we're talking about, praise this is in an academic setting here. Okay. Sorry, it's got to move my screen over just a little bit. My spaces are in the way. All right, here we go. Sorry, 1 second. Here we go. All right.
So check this out. Carol Dweck and her colleagues wanted to look into the impacts that praise had on children's development. So what they did is they took over 400 fifth grade students from all across the nation, and they did a really simple yet interesting study. Here's how it went down. They gave all the kids a really easy nonverbal IQ test. There were 10 questions, and at the end of the test, they praised all the children in one of 2 ways. The first group was praised for their intelligence. So they said, wow, great job, you must be really smart at this. Now the second group was praised for their effort. So they said, wow, great job, you must have worked really hard at this. Now this is a really subtle difference, but the impact it had is incredible. So after praising the kids and getting them divided up into the 2 groups, they gave them all an option for their next test. The first option was, hey, this next test is going to be a little bit harder, but it's going to be a great opportunity to learn and grow. Now the second option was, this next test will be similar to the first and you will surely do well on it. Now the interesting thing is, out of the group that was praised for their intelligence, 67% of them chose the easier option, while 92% of the kids who were praised for their effort chose the harder test. This is unbelievable to think about, how just the subtle difference in the way that they were praised had such an impact. Carol Dweck explains why this happens.
The child or adult hears, oh, you think I'm brilliant and talented. That's why you admire me. That's why you value me. I better not do anything that will disprove this evaluation. As a result, they enter a fixed mindset, they play it safe in the future, and they limit the growth of their talents. Whereas focusing on the strategies they use, the way they're stretching themselves and taking on hard tasks, the intense practice they're doing, those are the kinds of things that say to a child or an older athlete, it's about the process of growth. As a result, they don't feel, oh, if I make a mistake, you won't think I'm talented. They think, oh, if I don't take on hard things and stick to them, I'm not going to grow.
Next, Dweck and her colleagues gave all the kids a really difficult test. It was one that they would surely fail, but they wanted to look at how the different kids attacked this challenge. Dweck noticed that the group that was praised for effort worked harder, longer, and actually enjoyed this test more than the group that was praised for their intelligence. This group got really frustrated with this test and had the tendency to give up early. After this artificially induced failure round, all of the kids were given a third and final test. Now this test was the same level of difficulty as the first one, but check out the results. The group that was praised for their intelligence actually did worse on this test than the first one. Their average score actually dropped by 20%, while the group that was praised for their effort did significantly better, raising their average score by nearly 30%. This is a 50% difference in performance that was caused by a few subtle differences in the way that they were praised. This study shows how praise can either make or break a child's development. I mean, we all do it. We all want to be positive with the children we work with, so teachers, coaches, parents are always looking for ways to support their kids and tend to praise them quite a bit. So we need to look at research like this and realize, okay, praise is a good thing and there's nothing wrong with being positive, but we need to be very careful about praising someone's intelligence or abilities and focus more on the process and the effort.
And so it cuts
You
off,
might have seen
but it's the process and the effort. So I don't know why it cuts off early right there, but you all get the picture. All right, so let's come back to this conversation here. And I love that you all are adding resources into the chat. I have to say that every time I present, I get more and more, I grow. And that's what I love, is that you all are sharing information to contribute to the whole group as well. So I'm downloading and saving all of these notes too. Yes. Oh, thank you so much. All right. So let's talk about praise and mindset. So the idea is that if we just praise an outcome, or if we are focusing on abilities and intelligence and not thinking about what is the process that is done. And I get a little bit hesitant about praising effort. And here's why. It is good to praise effort here's a caveat. Sometimes what we perceive as effort is our perception and our bias and not the student's actual effort. From the outside, it can look like a student is not trying, and that student actually spent a long time on it. I remember one time when my son was working on a math project and the teacher's response was, I can tell that you didn't spend much time on it. And I know how much time he spent working on it. And so I think that I'm fully in favor of praising the process and helping students reflect on their effort. Be careful about judgment calls about how much effort they actually put in. So with that said, here is some guidance. Here is one of the resources that I've put in the materials is a mastery-oriented feedback card. And it models the type of language that praises the process. Different ways that we can focus attention on effort and strategy use versus abilities or intelligence. And it's a shift in a way that's not saying, well, I wish you had just tried harder, right? That doesn't feel good. And it's not helpful. It's not helpful because you actually don't know how much they tried. Sometimes the product can look terrible and they actually spent the longest on it, right? So we're helping them reflect and think about the process. Also on this card, we have phrases that we encourage. It's like really sentence frames for teachers. But then the other side has things to avoid saying and why. The most common thing we often say is, you are so smart. That was so brilliant. And that promotes a fixed mindset, because if a student answers a question correctly, and the response is, yes, that was brilliant, you're so smart, and then they answer a correct question incorrectly. Their takeaway is, oh, I'm not smart anymore, or I'm not good at this, right? And so if we think more about, let's talk about that process you used. If we only give students a grade or a letter or a number, we're again reinforcing a fixed mindset because we're just talking about the outcome instead of thinking about what was the process to get there. Yes. Okay, 10 minutes. Here we go. The last thing I want to share with you, very last thing I want to share with you, then we're going to come back together. We're going to come and just have a whole group conversation about any questions. So when we think about designing for learner agency, we have to be mindful of our words, our feedback, but also the words students tell themselves. So many learners have developed a negative mindset around math. They'll tell themselves, I'm just not good at it, right? We have to encourage students' self-reflection in a way that promotes a growth mindset. So there are 2 student reflection resources that I really suggest you take away and consider. One has some really great questions that work at all ages on how we can encourage students' self-reflection and a growth mindset. Questions like, how did we grow as a mathematician today? And it gets more specific than that. But there's one resource about that. And then the second resource are questions to reflect on about homework. So too many times homework is just about, did you get the right answer or not? Did you finish it or not? But can we think about it? And I know you're probably thinking, they don't even do the homework. They're not going to do reflection questions. You can reflect when you come back to class. But there needs to be some element of reflection because reflection helps us to stretch our possibilities. Reflection helps to prevent frustration and giving up. Reflection is probably one of the most least utilized tools in the classroom, and it can have some of the greatest impact. So the second resource are sample reflection questions about math homework. So we're not going to have time to do this last question as a breakout room, but I'm going to give you some time. Maybe you can add in the chat. Think about, can you see any ways in which you might be able to think about incorporating feedback in your classroom? Or maybe you see some ideas about how to incorporate reflection in your classroom in order to support design for learner agency. So I just want to take a moment. It also gives you time to reflect and process. Yes. Oh, the power of the word yet. So that also is in Carol Dweck's work. She talks about the power of the word yet. You might not yet be able to do it. There's so much power in that word yet. Oh, I love the signals, the hand signals too. Yes, reflection as an exit ticket. Yes. All right, so keep on thinking about that. The reflection is so powerful. Oh, emojis are great too. Emojis are fun ways to express, to reflect. Yes. I love that. Yeah, even that time to reflect and say why you agree or disagree. You're promoting that internal metacognition, that dialogue in a productive struggle way, right? Okay, so I love that, the Tower of Complaints. I love that show too. All right, I am saving this chat. This has been like one of the best chats ever. Can I tell you, thank you so much for feeding into this conversation. So in the interest of time, I want to share with you one last thing, because remember, one of the key takeaways is that you'll be able to identify the steps of the UDL design process. Okay, it starts by clarifying the goal, the learning goal and success criteria. Anticipate barriers to achieving that goal. Embrace variability in relation to that goal, and then take that information to design options that will reduce barriers and honor variability. And so when you're looking at those first 3 steps, you're really saying which guideline might provide a window of opportunity. And that's why we just focused on the guideline of sustaining effort and persistence, because that was a window of opportunity to help us think about supporting productive struggle. You don't want to try to do every guideline all the time. All right, so then last thing I want you to do is just take away my challenge for you is to consider the idea shared. Choose one strategy, resource, or idea to focus on. Maybe you have a list of top 5, but at least say this one I'm going to do first. And have that be your biggest takeaway, and maybe share it with a colleague. And then last but not least, because I love to end on a quote, this is one of my favorite quotes from Wilma Rudolph. I think it is so important when we think about this idea of productive struggle. And this quote says this: winning is great, sure. But if you are really going to do something in life, the secret is learning how to lose. Nobody goes undefeated all the time. If you can pick up after a crushing defeat and go on to win again, you are going to be a champion someday. So thank you everyone for being here today. Jeff, I turn it over to you, and I'll stick around and I'm going to save the chat.